The emergence of the Black Death in Europe. In the mid-14th century, Europe faced a disaster of unprecedented scale that changed the course of history forever. This catastrophe was given the mysterious and ominous name of the Black Death. Its appearance was sudden and terrifying, but to truly understand how this tragedy began, we must go back to Asia, where the plague originated. In the Middle Ages, trade routes connected the East and West, providing opportunities for the exchange of goods and the spread of deadly diseases. Experts agree that the bubonic plague originated in Central Asia, in the steppes where cultures and peoples mingled. Here, in clusters of rodents and fleas, the Yersinia pestis bacterium found ideal conditions for survival. It was along the Silk Road, followed by numerous caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals, that the disease began to spread westward. Travelers had no idea that they were carrying an invisible enemy that would wipe out entire cities within a few years. Historical chronicles tell us that the first recorded cases of infection appeared in the port cities of the Black Sea in the autumn of 1347. There, on the Taman Peninsula and in Crimea, the plague began its terrible march across Europe due to the arrival of Genoese merchants. Their ships, arriving from the eastern Mediterranean, brought not only goods, but also a contagious disease. Legends say that the disease was brought by corpses fleeing from the Mongol army, and by fleas that had been living on animal skins and clothing. The first outbreaks occurred in Italian cities, starting with Genoa and Marseille. There are grim accounts of people literally dying in the streets, unable to reach their homes, while the authorities of the first infected cities tried unsuccessfully to stop the spread of the disease by isolating the affected areas and imposing quarantine. However, there could only be one outcome. The plague was too fast and insidious. Ships, caravans, and merchants hurried together, followed by the fleas themselves, infecting human settlements further and further into the continent. In those years, people tried to explain the terrible disaster in different ways. The church often spoke of divine punishment for sins, while the people were gripped by fear and superstition, compounded by mysticism and conspiracy theories among different social classes. Some believed that the disease had been deliberately spread by enemies or secret societies in order to destroy large numbers of people. These assumptions were nothing more than attempts to find an explanation for an unknown evil, without medical knowledge or understanding of epidemiology. Contemporaries of the Black Death, including chroniclers and monks, described not only the horrors of physical illness, but also the emotions that gripped the cities: helplessness, horror, fear, and despair. People were divided, social ties were destroyed, as were hopes for salvation. But even in the midst of the epidemic, there were those who showed humanity: doctors, clergy, and ordinary residents who, despite the threat, tried to help the sick and orphaned. According to modern research, the exchange of goods and people along trade routes was the main channel for the spread of the plague, although some scientists point to other factors, such as climate change, which may have contributed to outbreaks of disease. The growth of cities and population density created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of infection. In addition, none of the medical practices of the time could effectively combat the disease. Treatment methods often exacerbated the condition of those infected or led to new outbreaks. Of particular interest is how civilization reacted to the emergence of a mysterious disease. Historians study letters, memoirs, and notes from those who survived the first weeks and months of the epidemic. They tell of panic in the markets, closed city gates, abandoned houses, and the fear of falling ill or even just coming into contact with suspicious people. This period marked the beginning of a difficult trial for European society, the echoes of which were felt for decades. Thus, having first appeared in the mysterious steppes of Asia and survived a dangerous journey through the trade corridors of the Mediterranean, the Black Death burst into the hearts of Europeans, plunging them into dark times. Huge human sacrifices destroyed families and cities. All this was the result of a single disease that laid the foundation for a new era in human history. But to understand the full scale of the disaster and learn how the pandemic developed in Europe, we must turn to the next stage: its rapid spread and the social consequences that inevitably followed. Symptoms and course of the disease. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, struck people swiftly and mercilessly. The disease began unexpectedly and developed at lightning speed, causing fear and panic among the population. The first symptoms were vivid but strikingly diverse, which only added fuel to the fire of misunderstanding and superstition. One of the most noticeable signs was the appearance of insidious tumors on the body. These painful lumps, filled with pus and blood, usually formed in the armpits, neck, or groin. The lymph nodes became inflamed and swollen, turning into black, blue, or purple bumps that served as an ominous sign of inevitable death. The name Black Death is directly related to the color of these tumors, which literally covered the body of the victim, resembling gloomy spots of grief and fear. The disease was accompanied by a high fever, which could reach 40 degrees, causing fever and burning from within. Weakness spread so quickly that the patient often could not even get out of bed. The head began to spin. Headaches and a terrible feeling of nausea tormented the patient. Saliva became sticky, breathing heavy and intermittent. In some cases, convulsions and loss of consciousness were observed, which shocked those around them and intensified the mystical aura of the disease. Many believed that the plague was a punishment from higher powers and sought to appease the gods or demons with various rituals. People wore amulets, carried herbs and special oils, and filled themselves with prayers and incantations in an attempt to protect themselves from the terrible fate. However, no measures could stop the rapid and sinister spread of the disease. Superstition gave rise to aggression and disbelief, which hindered even attempts at real medical assistance. Doctors at the time had limited knowledge about the nature of the plague. They observed the symptoms and tried to alleviate the suffering, but their methods often proved useless. Bloodletting was used in the hope of removing bad blood, compresses of herbs and salt were applied, and decoctions and ointments were prescribed, but no one could understand the true cause of the disease. Patients were isolated, although the mechanisms of transmission remained a mystery. Stories of people surviving the initial symptoms were rare and considered miraculous. The archives contain the stories of a monk named Gregory, who cared for the sick in one of the monasteries of Florence. His diaries reveal how quickly the disease sapped strength, but also how, thanks to faith and care, some managed to hold on longer, giving hope to those who had not yet come face to face with the plague. Thus, the symptoms of the Black Death became not just physical suffering, but a source of indescribable horror and mysticism. Tumors, fever, and weakness were combined with panic, which wove a growing wave of despair across Europe. The world was in the grip of a disease that seemed an insurmountable and mysterious force. Understanding the symptoms and progression of the disease is important not only from a medical point of view, but also for understanding the chronicle of human experiences at that time. People were left alone with an unknown enemy, where every symptom became a harbinger of the final journey. But soon it became necessary to look beyond the external manifestations to understand how the epidemic changed social structures and everyday life on the ancient continents. The next stage in the history of the Black Death will reveal the impact of the plague on the economy, culture, and society of Europe during those tragic years. Social and economic consequences of the epidemic. The Black Death, which claimed the lives of millions of Europeans in the mid-14th century, radically changed the social landscape of the continent. Mass mortality struck like a storm, destroying familiar foundations and forcing people to rethink their views on society and their own existence. One of the most noticeable consequences was a sharp labor shortage that shook agricultural land to its foundations. Many estates and farms were left without their usual peasant workforce, leading to a decline in production and food shortages. The new distribution of the population brought about changes in the social structure of Europe. Forced to compete for the remaining labor force, landowners were compelled to raise wages and ease working conditions. A sense of social mobility, previously almost impossible, emerged, inspiring hope in the hearts of the common people. Even serfs felt that their situation had become slightly less hopeless. More relaxed relations between social classes called the old hierarchical norms into question. Urban life also underwent profound changes. Trade routes, served by both small craftsmen and large merchants, were severely disrupted. The disappearance of a significant part of the population reduced demand for goods, while at the same time dealing a severe blow to supply as production capacity declined. Many workshops and shops closed, and those that survived began to seek new forms of cooperation and mutual assistance to overcome the crisis. There was a need to rethink urban management and social support. The European economy was at a crossroads. Agriculture, based on the intensive exploitation of slave labor, lost its former stability. The new conditions contributed to the development of tenant farming and the growth of the importance of free farmers. As a result, there was a gradual transition from a feudal model to a more market-oriented one, where land and labor became subjects of agreement. This process was accompanied by changes in legal relations and even the emergence of new forms of ownership. Many families who survived the catastrophe sought to strengthen their position through legal and economic innovations. The impact of the epidemic on religious institutions was ambiguous. Despite the clergy's desire to comfort and guide the desperate population, many believers began to experience doubts that grew into criticism of the Church's authority. One of the most prominent historical figures of the time was a monk named Gottfried from a monastery in Flanders, who openly questioned the actions of the higher clergy. His letters and sermons gained notoriety for their harsh criticism of the unreformed church structure, attracting supporters both inside and outside the monastery. Families who had lost loved ones experienced deep mourning and despair, which inevitably reflected in cultural practices and traditions. New forms of funeral rites emerged, and the fear of death intensified, becoming ingrained in folklore and folk tales. Scholars and chroniclers of the time left accounts of mysterious phenomena that were in some way connected to the epidemic. These stories created a mystical aura around the disaster, giving it the aura of inevitable punishment or a curse. At the same time, the first conspiracy theories began to circulate, sometimes blaming various social groups for spreading the disease. Jews and traveling performers faced suspicion and brutal persecution, leading to waves of violence and persecution. Historians note that such phenomena only exacerbated social conflicts and slowed down the recovery process. The complex social climate became fertile ground for rumors and sensationalism, which often strayed far from the real causes and mechanisms of the epidemic. As a result, the towns and villages that survived the Black Death took on different social forms and economic models. Society slowly but surely sought ways to achieve sustainable development and survival, despite all the upheavals. The changes that took place during this period had a profound impact on the further history of Europe, setting a course for change that ultimately led to the Renaissance. Social upheavals, destruction, and restructuring became the basis for new political and economic systems. The next part of our story will immerse you in the atmosphere of everyday life at that time and describe how everyday practices and cultural norms changed in the shadow of past disasters. Together, we will trace the steps that changed the face of the medieval world forever. The reaction of the Church and the people in the midst of the Black Death, which swept across Europe from 1347 to 1351, the Church faced its greatest test. The epidemic, which claimed thousands of lives every day, called into question not only the patience of the laity, but also the authority of the clergy. The leaders of religious institutions sought explanations for this terrible disaster within the framework of their faith, trying to comfort souls burning with fear and at the same time restore order. Church hierarchs proclaimed the plague to be God's punishment for the sins of humanity. Sermons became increasingly alarming. Priests called for repentance, prayer processions, and austerity. Flagellants, groups of religious fanatics who whipped themselves in incredible agony, appeared especially frequently in the streets of cities, hoping to atone for the sins of the people and thereby appease God. Their processions sometimes reached the scale of mass pilgrimages, and the rituals were accompanied by mournful psalm singing. However, such religious activity had a dual effect. For some, it became a saving spiritual refuge, a source of hope in the face of death. For others, it was a source of fear and suspicion. Many ordinary people, frightened by the powerlessness of the authorities and the mysterious force of the disease, began to look for someone to blame, not only in themselves, but also among their neighbors. This gave rise to waves of accusations of witchcraft, heresy, and conspiracy. Jewish communities often became targets. In the first months of the epidemic, rumors that Jews were deliberately poisoning wells spread throughout Europe. Despite the fact that such claims had no scientific basis and were not supported by facts, suburbs and villages were subjected to brutal pogroms. Hundreds and even thousands of innocent people fell victim to violent pogroms, which exacerbated social tensions and caused new suffering. In addition, doubts sometimes arose within the church. Monks and scholars of the time tried to understand the nature of the disease through observation, although they were limited by their spiritual worldview. Some of them, such as the monk Gregory of Saint-Denis, put forward theories that the plague could be linked to air pollution or malevolent astral influences. Such ideas were mixed with mysticism and religious beliefs, adding a touch of mystery and fear to an already tense atmosphere. In some regions, mystical practices and folk rituals intensified. People wore amulets, laid crosses made of salt on the thresholds of their homes, and women and elderly people, who often became healers, offered to treat the disease with herbs and prayers. Memorial services were held in churches, where priests prayed to God to end the plague. The sound of bells announcing death seemed endless, reinforcing the feeling that the end of the world was near. Both official religious institutions and secret sects flourished in the cities, sometimes offering alternative explanations and methods of dealing with the disaster. Some prophets proclaimed the imminent revival of the world and the coming of new saints, which attracted the weary and frightened masses. The development of mass religious movements during this period was not only a reaction to the deadly threat, but also a unique social phenomenon. People sought unity in fear and hope, creating communities where they could be heard and supported. Often, these collective movements became a source of outbreaks of religious fanaticism and intolerance. Alongside religious explanations, rumors spread about secret conspiracies among the urban elite and even the church itself. Some believed that the disease was caused by the elite's unwillingness to reveal the truth, or even by the deliberate use of the infection for political purposes. These conspiracy theories, although unproven, found their way into folklore and the writings of contemporaries, adding a dark charm to the era. An important part of the reaction was the fear of death, which provoked the emergence of many new rituals and ceremonies aimed at appeasing the soul and seeking forgiveness in the face of the inevitable. Many mothers and wives prayed not so much for the salvation of physical bodies as for the salvation of the souls of the dead. Thus, the reaction of the church and the people to the Black Death was multifaceted and tense. On the one hand, the church tried to maintain its authority through religious practices and explanations. On the other hand, the people found themselves in a state of duality between faith and fear, which gave rise to both spiritual quests and social crises. This complex mixture of faith, mysticism, fear, and hopelessness shaped Europe during one of its darkest periods. Moving on to an analysis of the consequences of this spiritual upheaval, it is worth noting how changes in the social structure and relations between the people and the church laid the foundation for subsequent historical transformations. Theories of the origin and conspiracies surrounding the plague. In the 14th century, when the Black Death swept across Europe, many questions arose about its origin and motives. Contemporaries tried to explain the catastrophe in different ways. Some saw the plague as God's punishment for the sins of mankind. Clergymen denounced debauchery and injustice, asserting that the disease was a punishment from above. These religious interpretations resonated with the masses, who were further emboldened by their fear of an unknown enemy. However, in addition to religious views, there were also more practical theories. One of them was the spread of the disease through dirty ships and trade routes. Many historians point out that the infection came from the Eastern Mediterranean, which was associated with wars and the movement of armies. It was through port cities and caravans that the plague spread to European cities, where unsanitary conditions and close contact between people created a favorable environment for bacteria. Interestingly, mystical versions also appeared. For example, there were stories of a devilish conspiracy in which secret societies deliberately spread the plague to enslave the world. These theories fueled an atmosphere of panic and suspicion, often leading to witch hunts and persecution of Jews, who were blamed for the disasters. Such accusations, though unjust, show how deeply fear had penetrated people's hearts. Some historians suggest that natural disasters and climate change contributed to the plague. Lower temperatures and crop failures weakened the population, making people more vulnerable to infection. The relationship between weather conditions and the spread of disease has been studied extensively, providing a more comprehensive view of the causes of the disaster. Scientists have long debated the bacteria that caused the plague. In the 19th century, the bacterium Yersinia pestis was discovered, but questions about whether it was the cause remain to this day. In some regions, the disease manifested itself differently, and sometimes outbreaks occurred in the absence of obvious carriers, giving rise to new hypotheses. Rumors and speculation also circulated among royalty and influential figures. Emperor Charles XIV, who ruled during part of this period, allegedly received secret reports from his advisors about possible biological attacks by enemies. Although there is no direct evidence of such intrigues, these stories reflect the anxieties of an era when every event was perceived through the prism of fear and mistrust. It is also interesting to look at the black mark, tattoos and marks that, according to legend, were applied by victims or agents of the conspiracy. The very idea of biological weapons in the Middle Ages sounds anecdotal, but the facts of infection using fabrics and objects brought from infected areas raise doubts. Perhaps someone deliberately contributed to the spread of the epidemic. In addition, there are theories that the plague was the result of experiments by alchemists and early healers who tried to control life and death. Their secret knowledge could have led to a catastrophe that was misinterpreted as a manifestation of evil or divine retribution. References to alchemical treatises and mysterious recipes add a touch of mysticism to the case. No less important is the role of urban legends passed down from generation to generation. Stories about sinister creatures, ghosts, and mysterious diseases fed the collective imagination. These stories served not only as explanations for tragedies, but also as attempts to preserve the memory of the victims, making their suffering immortal in the mouths of their descendants. Thus, combining scientific data, religious views, and mystical interpretations, we see how multifaceted humanity's reaction to this terrible ordeal was. Faith, fear, and attempts to rationalize the incomprehensible created a complex kaleidoscope of versions and theories, many of which still surprise and provoke debate today. This historical experience reminds us how important it is to search carefully for the truth among a multitude of assumptions. As we delve deeper into the mysteries and secrets of the Black Death, we will see that behind each version lie complex social and cultural processes. In the next part, we will look at how the disease affected everyday life, the healthcare system, and the economy of medieval Europe, revealing new aspects of this terrible pandemic, ways of spreading, and attempts to contain the epidemic. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was engulfed in an unprecedented tragedy. The Black Death, considered a sinister, punitive force of fate, spread rapidly across vast areas of the continent. The spread of this epidemic was made possible by a number of factors related to intensive trade, military campaigns, and population migration. Of particular importance was the Black Sea's position as a crossroads between East and West trade routes. The first wave of infection began in this region, from where the bubonic plague quickly spread deep into European countries. Portuguese, Italian, and French ports, which were gateways to the European world, became synonymous with mortal danger. The fates of cities such as Genoa and Marseille were forever intertwined with the history of the epidemic. Rats and fleas on merchant ships played a significant role in spreading the disease. These carriers of infection quickly spread throughout cities, where crowds of people created ideal conditions for infection. People, not understanding the nature of the disease, often perceived it as a manifestation of divine punishment or sinister mysticism. Medical knowledge at the time was insufficient to effectively combat the epidemic, which gave rise to many superstitions and irrational measures. Nevertheless, attempts were already being made to limit the spread of the disease, which forever changed society's attitude toward hygiene and quarantine. Quarantine as a tool to combat the terrible plague was first systematically used in the 14th century. Italian cities were pioneers in the creation of special quarantine stations where arriving ships and people were subjected to prolonged isolation. The term quarantine comes from a word meaning 40 days, symbolizing the time needed to detect a possible disease. Such measures slowed the spread of infection, although they could not completely stop the epidemic. Restrictions on entering and leaving cities, increased border controls, and even the use of military personnel became part of a new reality that residents were forced to accept. The impact of the pandemic on the economy and social structure was enormous. Many cities were forced to close their gates for months or even years. Here, power belonged to councils of elders, merchants, and officials who introduced strict regulations to prevent panic and the spread of disease. The authorities used methods of separating the sick from the healthy, distributing food, and conducting sanitary inspections, which were progressive for the time. Despite fear and misunderstanding, these were the first steps toward the formation of a public health system. The rulers knew that defeating this terrible disease was not only a medical challenge, but also a matter of political stability. Particular attention was paid to the city-states of Italy, especially Venice and Genoa, which had powerful armies and rich merchant fleets. Their authorities did not simply follow medical prescriptions, but introduced their own strict measures. Venice, known for its discipline and organization, was the first to establish quarantine ports and treatment centers for the infected. These measures helped limit the spread of the epidemic in the city, but did not prevent tragedy entirely. Sometimes officials faced resistance from the population, who feared isolation and tried to circumvent the rules. Conflicts and protests further intensified the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. In Northern Europe, measures to combat the plague were taken with varying degrees of effectiveness. Where governments and city councils took the threat seriously from the outset, quarantine measures were introduced more quickly and more strictly. In England and France, city walls and fortresses became both a protection and a trap for residents. In some cases, the closure of trade routes and restrictions on movement helped to slow the spread of the disease. However, the lack of a single centralized authority complicated the situation and led to chaos. Information about the epidemic was often sensationalized and frightening, leading to panic and violence, and sometimes to persecution of minorities who were falsely accused of spreading the disease. In places where the disease reached its peak, the homes of those who fell ill were locked, and residents sought to flee, often without understanding the scale of the impending threat. This led to a new wave of infections and complicated medical efforts. Doctors and healers, despite their lack of modern knowledge, tried to isolate the sick and use herbs, blood, and fumigations. There are known cases where doctors dressed in long cloaks and masks with long beaks filled with medicinal herbs, which became not only protection, but also a symbol of fear of the disease. Despite their limited understanding, these attempts reflect humanity's first steps in the fight against infection. Of particular interest are accounts of the use of urban quarantine stations, where the sick were placed separately to reduce the spread of disease. These stations, often surrounded by fences and guarded by armed men, were a kind of dead zone where few survived. Calls by doctors and officials for the population to observe quarantine periods often went unheeded, reflecting the limitations of communication and the level of fear. At the same time, it was these measures that laid the foundations for future health control systems. Religious and state leaders played an important role in containing the epidemic. Some monarchs organized special commissions and financial support for medical workers and hospitals. However, religious leaders often called for repentance and prayer, considering the disease a punishment for the sins of humanity. This mixture of spiritual and practical approaches created a special atmosphere. From deep fear to determination to resist disaster. Legends arose in society about mysterious signs and prophecies, which only exacerbated the general mental state of the masses. Although many measures seemed cruel and inhumane, historians recognize that these early quarantine practices played a significant role in limiting the speed of spread. It is important to remember that in the context of medieval medicine and the lack of modern knowledge, any attempts to control the epidemic were extremely difficult. Nevertheless, the experience of the 14th century laid the foundation for the development of medicine and sanitation in the centuries that followed. The search for the causes of the disease and theories of its spread through the air, water, and animals took their first scientific shape in the following decades. Looking at the facts, the question inevitably arises: could the authorities have done more and better if they had been better informed? Historians suggest that the high mortality rate was caused not only by the plague virus, but also by a combination of social factors such as overcrowded cities, poor hygiene, and a lack of effective precautions. Nevertheless, it was the efforts of the first quarantine systems that stopped the epidemic, which could have wiped out almost the entire population of Europe. It should be noted that in some regions, local principles of disease control, for example in Sicily or Crimea, were quite successful and could be considered a model of a sensible approach. The intense struggle against the plague had an incredible impact on public consciousness. The loss of thousands of lives shook the internal structures of states and cities, forcing people to reflect on the power of nature and their place in the world. Attempts to control the situation forced the authorities to actively intervene in private life, which gave rise to new rules and traditions. The quarantine system became a kind of test of the ability of human institutions to adapt to a large-scale threat. The challenges of those years taught us lessons and showed that unity of action between state and city structures is critical to saving lives. Thus, the spread of the Black Death and attempts to contain it serve as a vivid testimony to the complexity and unpredictability of epidemics. The fight against the disease was not only a medical issue, but also a test of Europe's social, political, and cultural integrity. Much of what seemed impossible and terrifying became the basis for improving healthcare and public policy in the fight against infectious diseases. In this tense historical period, we see both tragedy and the first lessons that later saved millions of lives. Now that we have unraveled the key mechanisms of the plague's spread and assessed the effectiveness of the measures taken, we can begin to study how the disease itself changed the face of society and influenced civilizational processes. In the next chapter, we will delve into the social consequences of the epidemic and the transformation of the worldview of European peoples. The legacy of the Black Death in European history. The Black Death left an indelible mark on European history, affecting society much more deeply than could have been imagined at the time. The epidemic that broke out in the 14th century was a catalyst for changes that affected all spheres of life, from the economy to worldview. Those who survived this horror were forced to rethink their place in the world and their relationship with the society around them, which opened the door to new ideas and approaches. A society that had survived a deadly blow found itself on the verge of major transformations. Peasants and artisans, who found themselves in short supply due to mass deaths, were able to demand better working conditions and pay. The power of large landowners gradually weakened, and the emergence of new influential classes gained momentum. The economy began to shift toward greater mobility and innovation, which stimulated the development of trade and cities. Science and medicine, which had been given a boost by the trials of the Black Death, found additional motivation for research. Although the methods of the time remained primitive, the growing interest in observation and the systematization of knowledge was an important milestone. Many doctors, such as the Italian scientist Gallieno, sought to find explanations for the terrible disease, which contributed to a gradual departure from purely religious views on health and disease. Culture and art, reflecting the horrors of the pandemic, simultaneously captured moments of deep emotion and mysticism. The paintings, music, and literature of the time are filled with images of death, fear, and hope. These works made people think about the fragility of human life, sparking a wave of philosophical reflection and religious transformation, which was also reflected in the formation of new trends in art and the mission of the Church. The tragedy changed people's worldview. They became more conscious of their health, their environment, and their social responsibilities. The feeling of vulnerability and the inability to control one's destiny gave rise to a new literature that allowed for a broader view of life and death. The understanding of the transience of existence prompted a search for new meanings and values, which was influenced by both religious and secular movements. The lessons learned by humanity from this horror cannot be overlooked. The fight against infections, sanitary reforms, and attempts to systematically monitor the health of the population laid the foundation for the development of epidemiology. This period stimulated the transition to more organized forms of governance and social responsibility, which became particularly evident in the following centuries when European states began to build modern healthcare systems. Politically, the Black Death weakened traditional centers of power and at the same time provided an opportunity for small, previously insignificant groups to strengthen their positions. The emergence of new forms of social organization foreshadowed later revolutions and social upheavals. Rulers were forced to seek new ways to maintain control, which led to the development of bureaucracy and centralized administration. The individual stories of people who survived the tragedy played a special role. The name of the dentist Ghirlandaio, known for his stories about doctors and residents of Florence, preserves the memory of how individuals fought against the unknown. Despite all their losses and fears, these heroes demonstrated courage and a desire to help their neighbors, inspiring subsequent generations to self-sacrifice and scientific curiosity. Thus, the Black Death not only claimed millions of lives, but also became a turning point in European history. This crisis forced humanity to see the world through different eyes, expanded the boundaries of knowledge, and changed social structures. Most importantly, the lessons learned from this bitter experience helped pave the way for progress and new opportunities in a world that would never be the same again. As we continue to explore the consequences of the Black Death, we will look at how these changes were reflected in the culture and science of the following centuries, as well as how the memory of the tragedy shaped the face of modern Europe.